Peter. All right.
Very good.
Hey, Peter.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, Peter.
Hi.
Welcome, Peter.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Howie, you got anybody else waiting in the weight room?
Nope.
He let him out. Great.
That's it?
Please release me.
Why don't we get started then, I think.
Sure.
Just as a bit of an introduction, I think everybody, after we had sent Betty Rosa our comments about high-stakes standardized testing and an appeal for their elimination and the development of an alternative, Peter also had sent to me the policy framework for tomorrow's learning. And I said, gee, that fits in well with the idea of not only an alternative to high-stakes standardized testing, but the whole question of what would be an alternative not only for accountability, but what could motivate students more, especially impoverished kids of color, and to generate more success with them. So I guess the idea for today is to talk with Peter about this and have him give us some insight to where he thinks this could go, and whether or not it's a reasonable alternative to raise with Betty Rosa in terms of a direction. So, Peter, the floor is yours.
Before we get going here, I just want to remind everybody I'm recording the meeting, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to share this with other school groups, such as the Southwest Common Council, to review the information you're going to be covering, Peter.
Very good. Well, first of all, I want to thank Dan for encouraging me to check in with you folks. But I also want to quickly apologize because I'm not presenting anything as an expert in this case. We've like you, we've all been on a search for some time in terms of what's an effective. First of all, what's the issue? How do you frame it so it's understandable? And how do you advance it so it is engageable, particularly with policymakers and power structures? And the first thing I want to point out is that the document, I hope you all had a chance to, I only sent you the first 7 or 8 pages. If you look it up on the actual website, it's much longer. But these are highlights that are enough for us, I think. But the first observation is this was actually done in 1917, long before COVID. And it was the beginning. By then, the dissatisfaction with the 30 years of the standards-based accountability infrastructure had become clear. I mean, it was becoming a common conversation that having, ever since a nation at risk, and then Common Core, common standards, common testing year, summative testing, tying that to disaggregations around because of the issues of equity, which was fine. And then tying it to individual students, to individual teachers, and putting together a very, very caustic both student accountability infrastructure and even more so a teacher infrastructure. So the system was already collapsing. And there was plenty of evidence that it had not done the primary purpose, which is to serve not only all kids, but the very kids who were least served before getting served. The gaps were not closing. And the only reason this one struck me is because Linda Darling-Hammond, I don't know if any of you would remember this, Linda was working with me and Adam in Rochester in it must have been probably 85, 86, when we very, very first started the conversation at that time around teacher empowerment, just trying to get things like peer review, mentor teachers, career ladders, that kind of thing. So Linda's an old player. She was also considered to be Arnie Duncan's Secretary of Education. I wish she had been. She was embattled with a few other politicos, and they passed over her and went with Arnie. But my point is that Linda is a substantive, strategic player. She has standing in the conversation. And unlike some of us trying to get a commissioner's attention with good ideas and in I would say, common language, we still end up looking like a hub, what do you call it, a rump group trying to get some attention. And that's not negative or positive. It's just when you're trying to deal with getting some sort of policy structure access, it doesn't hurt to have it look like it's at least based on some sort of a data-driven, research-based argument. So having said that, when I sent this to Dan, it was only because it finally, after all those years, even someone like Linda, who was leading the standards movement with Mark Tucker, who was leading the accountability teacher movement, was beginning to say, wait a minute, maybe we gotta rethink this. And in this thing, when she starts talking about deeper learning, student-centered learning, equity, which we can discuss the meanings of these words, democracy, and then trust, judgment, and responsibility. Those are the first time that I had seen coming out of that movement the acknowledgement that these are summative, I mean, they're cumulative. It's not about curriculum only. It's not about power structure only. There is a systemic issue behind the inequities, and there's systemic issues around the failure of the current system. And to just, say this for the obvious, the current system, once it got going, and this is 100 years ago when the Committee of 10 got started, but it really got going after World War II, when there was an emerging middle class and more kids were actually coming to school. Before World War II, the number of kids that got to high school were less than 50%. So it's only when they all started coming that we started getting the disaggregations of dropouts that made it look like we were now failing at a time when we weren't before. And the truth is we've never been successful. The system has been organized in grade structure, age structure, content structure, scope and sequence badly or well, but that particular structure is what then the common core and the accountability infrastructure was built on. And we all call that now the industrial model. And it sorts and it sifts, it tracks, it grades, all of that. Now having said that, as you try to back out of that, you're in the dilemma of the fact that we're very, very big and wealthy, not wealthy as in we are wealthy, but there's a lot of money. There's a big bucks in education, K-12. And when you start trying to restructure it, never mind transform it, you're running into every one of the vested interests, whether they're conscious or unconscious, whether it's the lunchroom structure, which is on the transportation structure, or the certification structure, or the separate subject structures, which there's an industry behind every subject, all of it. You're coming against the classic bureaucracy, and every time you take 2 steps forward, you get neutralized with a little change in leadership or inertia, and you drift backwards. So in the last maybe 10 years, we've been increasingly hearing the word transformation rather than reform, as in you can't keep tightening the screws on this sucker and get it to do any better. It is going to suck you back to yesterday. So how do you somehow break through it, leap over it, go around it, but don't start off with the assumptions of either common standards, common testing, and common structures. So when Linda came up with this one, my first response was, wow, okay, even the old reformers that have held on from the perspective of equity, as in civil rights, to getting our kids to where your kids have been, but doing the same thing harder for us, which has been basically the civil rights argument for 30 years. If you can do it for some kids, you can do it for all kids. Why can't you do it for our kids? And every time we try to do that, we're at, in this, now I'm coaching this in today's current conversation of Black Lives Matter and the context of real cultural tolerance. Because once you start trying to deal with kids that were never valued in the system, with a history of disaffection and non-inclusion, and to make the rule that you will only get to the end game when you act like us, has been part of the barrier here. There's no engagement from the ownership side. So there's been about 8 or 9 years now of using words like agency and context relevance and cultural sensitivity and passion and learning, etc. So that's kind of morphed into a learner-centered philosophy. It says you start with wherever the kid is, and you're coming at it from their strengths and their passions. You don't come at it as if there's deficits, and whatever the assessment is, you're trying to get some understanding of the competencies they currently have, and then you try to move them incrementally along the pathway that they are negotiating with you because they actually understand what they want to do. So these were the 4 or 5 principles that Linda put in, And I want to stop for a while and make sure we even understand what they are. But having said that, this was written in 17. In the process of getting ready for this, I came across the one that you did just in May, this past May. And that's the one I think I sent to Dan, and I don't know if you forwarded it, Dan. It's the 10 things, or the 10, what's the name of it? Oh, the New Deal. The New Deal, the top 10 policy moves. And this is written in May, well into the COVID exercise. And let me finish with that framing, and then we can have the conversation. As I said a minute ago, trying to reform something that is as dense as our industry, when it is running badly, but it's running at full speed, it's almost impossible to move it systemically. Well, COVID disrupted it. We have got that unintended disruption, and the system is already now wide open. And all the evidence is it exposed, first of all, the failure of the drill and kill strategies. And even everybody going online, now the parents are seeing what drill and kill looks like when the worksheets are in Zoom. So the disaffection is even getting worse, and the rules are significantly breaking and changing. So Linda wrote this one in terms of we don't have to now break the system, it's broken. I mean, physically it's broken up. So we need to grab the leadership around how you use time and space and people, pedagogy, resources, internet, etc., and bring pedagogical practice to the online, anytime, anywhere exercise, and grab a hold of the what I will call the old community school model, because you can't even begin to do the kind of individualization, even in small groups, non-tracked, when it's always a load of 30 kids or 35 kids at a time, five treatments a day. That organization is going to kill us. So how do you bring teachers together in new structures with caseloads that are distributed? The kids are shuffled around in different ways, including the use of the real community, whether it's the not-for-profits, the YMCAs, some of the athletic exercises. There's no reason why you couldn't take some group of 30, well, let's say the old idea of a cluster, 4 or 5 teachers and with 30 kids each, and all the special teachers, just in terms of head counts, and then expand that into internships and into the YMCAs and the boys clubs and things like that, and begin to have, and even external music, all the arts, and pass some of the certification barriers, so that there's kids, you have kids that are in a program, they have a pathway, a learning pathway, that the teachers are still the masters of the negotiations of. They're the ones sanctioning it or approving it or negotiating it, so that it is all for credit. And the kids' program is probably an 8-hour day, and it's not all in the building, and it's not all the certified people, but it's all part of a kind of an agreed-to pathway. And the end games are always done with some sort of performance assessments. And the performance assessments are assessments for learning and for exhibition. So it's never mastery. Like when a kid is, it's learning science. It is where it is, and does the kid know where it is? And would adults be able to interact with that student in a way where they could agree? That is pretty good. And these are the strengths and these are the weaknesses, and what do we need to do to get better? And to the extent that negotiation leads to the next round of whatever the activities or the learning exercises are, and the student begins to own that, and over time they are literally in reflective mode, in a self-directed mode, but not isolated. They're still in the community. So that's the learning pathway piece. And the other fundamental piece of this is, as much as I talk about individualized learning, there's a lot of rhetoric now, and I mean that positively, about the community and democracy and inclusion. So the issue is the old advisory structures, where you have stable teachers with stable groups for 3 or 4 years at a time, whether it's 3 or 4 teachers with a bigger group, but you know them well, you know their families, you've negotiated the programs with the families and the kids, you've solved problems with counselors and agency players that are part of your community of resources. And in that sense, each student is encouraged over time to accept the responsibility to be in a community of learners, in a democracy, doing projects, doing social service projects, or projects for the school, or with the government. So the 2 issues are increasing the child's individual pathway around passion and competence, but embed that in a community that is not only democratic, it is what we would call civics in action. And she uses words like authentic learning and performance assessment, not summative assessment, diagnostic, reflective assessments of where the kid is with the kid. And so those are the 2 or 3 big ones. The first being break up the time and space, rethink the pedagogy, which is the hardest part, because it's hard to do some of this stuff well. And then organize time and space, teachers, resources, and students into cohorts that can build a culture, what we would call climate, the climate school, the climate of a school, a culture of shared responsibility, and then build that into a community of resources that gets you out of a school-only 5-hour structure and puts it embedded in what they call authentic learning, problem solving, critical thinking, social emotional skill sets being developed. And that's pretty much what this is arguing is the design, or the systemic question of the design, to go from where we are to where we have the opportunity to go as we come back out of the COVID dilemma, by not going back to yesterday, but rethinking at the policy level between the state and the district, with picking up these threads and building in the capacity and the structures to do it. So that's about the shortest outline I can provide to this thing. So having said that, if you had looked at any of these, I would suggest now we simply have a discussion about either the viability of it as a whole, or the understanding of the pieces as they were outlined in it. How's that?
Sounds good.
But could you please start off by finding out who Peter McWalters is and why you're meeting with us? I mean, so I know you. I've known you for 30 years.
Yes.
And of course I agree with you on this. But I'm wondering, I don't know what you've been doing for the last 20 years, and what is your hope to accomplish with us, in Rochester? I'm assuming you live in Rochester now?
No, I'm in Providence. I haven't left anywhere.
Okay, you're still in Providence, okay. But I'm wondering
I'm only connected.
I'm wondering if we
Dan,
can have some of that background information so that
Sure.
we can,
Yep.
accomplish what we want to accomplish.
When I left Rochester, I became the commissioner in Rhode Island, and I did that until '09. So the good news is that means between the superintendency and the commissionership, in those particular years, I was
Yes.
literally, because of not my standing as in competence, but my job standing, I was there for Nation at Risk. I was there for the Governors Conventions in '89. I was with Mark Tucker and Linda for the beginning of the Common Core movement. I was the president of the National Chiefs Association when No Child Left Behind was signed. I sat in the White House with Bush and tried to slow it down and got beat up by spellings. So I feel like I represent the system for the last 40 years in the decent sense of trying to get it moved. I was one of the first people that did disaggregations and showed that the gaps were real, and did cohort survival from 9 through 12 to make sure people really saw that we actually used to say we had graduation rates, even in Rochester, and this was when I first was there with Lavelle, graduation rates sounded like you were in the 80s and 90s, because you didn't count a child in the graduation cohort until the 11th grade. It was very clever, because most kids drop out in the 10th grade when they're 16. We were the ones that put in the fact that no, we wanted every child that was handed off to a Rochester school into the 9th grade became a fixed item. You had to account for that cohort survival to the 12th grade, and that was the first year we came out with the fact that we had a under 50% graduation rate in truth. So having started there, and then been part of the Common Core, I was one of the advocates of the Common Core, and then of course I was an enemy when they all of a sudden made the Common Core mandate, or you couldn't get the race to the top money. It was never meant to be, by those of us who generated it, something that was meant to be a command. It was supposed to be considered by districts and teachers and communities as what would you think of this as something that you would want all kids to somehow acquire and be able to perform in. So the Common Core I was part of the 2 test infrastructures that followed that, and as well as I could either manage it or neutralize it or adapt it. I feel like by the time I left, and I left in '09, just as the recession hit, I had already been part of the folks saying, this is not, you're making it harder and harder and harder to actually reach all of the kids as you've gotten more sterile in terms of the machinery. The standards were sterile, the testing is sterile, the infrastructure is sterile, and it turns out you end up with more remediation than enrichment. So by the time I left, I was kind of done with that. And then I ended up working with Linda herself. This is the same Linda, but mine was with her from 09 to, I guess, 11 on teacher competencies and trying to rethink certification and pedagogy, which that was good work. And then I ended up working with something called Education Reimagined, which came out of a Washington think tank trying to get all the stakeholders together in the same suspect groups you all know, the federal, the national teachers, the school committees, the politicians, the business community, higher ed, K-12, and we spent 3 years trying to come up with a vision and mission statement, and and Dan, I'm pretty sure you have it. I can share that electronically with people.
Okay.
And that became the basis of a group that is still in existence, and that's what I'm consulting with right now. We don't run any programs. We're simply trying to have conversations at the community level, and it's all around this idea of learner-centeredness. And the example is, I'll even use Dan. I would say it's just an expanded conversation of the old school without walls. You start with where passion is, and you use all community learning anytime, anywhere, and you always have exhibitions and performance as the way you judge the current status. And it is totally based on what I would call deep personal relationships between the student and the teachers, the students and the families and the teachers. It's based on trust, and it's based on continuous shared responsibility in the sense of what I would call democratic. But in that conversation, over the time I've been doing it, I have also learned in this kind of Black Lives Matter environment that even when we think we're doing that well, and this is some of the workshops that you've just been through, I was with you a couple of them here, too often that still sounds like we're here to find a way to increase your access to what we're offering because it's still what we have that you need, as opposed to what do you want, what do you think you need, and how do you set the conversation up so that I'm an equal but participant in getting you where you want to go. So that's, if there's something that's personal about this conversation, I'm pretty well anchored now in this personalized, student-centered, competency but not mastery-based system of trying to get students supporting their agency, their strengths, and then the dynamic of pedagogy is making sure that they increasingly get control of their own learning in ways that is reflective, mature, and can handle the self-criticism and the judgments of other adults that they trust because we are invested in each other. So having said that, when I sent this to Dan, I didn't send it as an offer to have this conversation as this I'm advocating or an expert in it. It was because it sounded like you folks are in the same place of multiple attempts, both structurally, pedagogically, and kind of policy levels, trying to get the system to move. And I think the idea of dealing with the state is the right one because you've got a district, and I don't mean this negatively, but the leadership changes, the financial crunch. I can't imagine the system itself can do it alone. It's in a county that is wealthy but is not part of the answer yet. And it's got a state that is still struggling with resolving its own levers of interest and support. And that's why I think dealing with the commission is a good idea. And I have less knowledge right now of the dynamics between the superintendent, the mayor, and the school committee. I have little to offer other than the fact that little conversation is one of 3 or 4 in the hierarchy that all have to be part of resolving what are the major levers that we're using to restructure. That's who I am.
Other folks, questions in terms of anything Peter has said? Go ahead, Ralph.
Peter,
Yes.
you've always been one of my heroes, always, and continue to be. So I read what Dan put out, and of course I levitated out the chair. School Without Walls has been there for, I guess, decades.
Oh, yeah.
50 years.
50 years.
Yeah, and I think I may have written a book on a true community school in Rochester. To the county manager, Jack Doyle, was so happy talking to his governor, Pataki, that the governor came and toured, and I mean, he examined School 17 from top to bottom and declared it a state model of community school. So that's great.
That's right.
But boom, as soon as I left, it fell on its face.
That's right.
And as a matter of fact, they had 12 years into retirement, they asked me to come back and lift it up again.
Yeah.
You know, so education is like this huge oil tanker going down the ocean, and it just can't turn, or doesn't want to turn.
Right.
And change is, I mean, so many people are invested, and like you said, Peter, there's billions, maybe
That's right.
hundreds of billions of dollars invested, special ed, and so on and so forth. So it's really easy to ignore School Without Walls, School 17, community school initiatives, stuff that John Botte is trying to do, and so many other people. I said before with this group that I believe I have a sense, intuitive sense of opportunity, and I think this pandemic is an opportunity for movement. But it's certainly once in a lifetime, and it's going to take, I think, a lot more than our efforts. I think we need to combine and link arms with other like groups in New York State to get political traction. That being said, when I read the 5 points on the executive summary, one of the things, of course, you know my history with childhood lead poisoning. And special ed is like a vortex. Kids go in there, Peter, and they don't come out. They're not declassified. And if they are declassified, they're declassified for the wrong reason. I did my doctoral dissertation at the University of Rochester Medical Center on brain plasticity and restoring cognitive function for lead-poisoned children with the use of computer software. That dissertation was on the website of Mount Sinai Hospital for 6 years. It is now outdated. It's like way outdated. When it comes to the gaming industry and the brain training industry and the software, we in education are horse and buggy. Even worse. I think some of it's, I just want to go in, I mean, I'm really passionate about this because we have now the technology and the ability to test children at the earliest ages, and with the software that's available, pinpoint the deficiencies in the point of the brain that is lacking. And we have now the software to boost that. So if it's impulsivity, the frontal cortex, we have software. The Swedish company has software that is getting kids off ADHD medication.
Yeah.
I mean, they've done that for years. We're not paying attention. We're not paying attention. I'd like to see a 6th bullet on this, And Dan has been saying this for a long time, as well as others on this Zoom. We need to pay attention to current research in education. I mean, we just, it is a form of arrogance. We need to connect current research to classroom practice. And we're not doing that. We haven't done that.
Right.
And that is something that is flying over the heads of many of our reform movement initiatives. And kids are suffering. We can stop the flood of children who are traumatized, children who have extensive stress leading to debilitating anxiety, fueled with children who have been lead poisoned.
Yeah.
I mean, that we need to cut off the spigot for that and stop that. But how about those kids that are being affected by that? Well, now we have technology that can help those children, and we're not paying attention to it. We're not using it. We're not bringing it to the classroom, and it's something that I think might be valuable to include in this wonderful proposal, Peter. I really love this proposal that what you just outlined.
I'm going to jump in only because, Peter, I don't know if you want to respond to Ralph, but also Jamie has a question that she'd like to answer. But go ahead first, Peter, if you want.
No, I would concur with that, and that's why I think that if you get a chance to go to the one that's written now, Linda's the one that says the New Deal, she speaks much more in those terms, as in when she says closing the digital divide, she doesn't just mean every kid gets it and we get the Wi-Fi, the broadband. She says the whole idea of using what is now emerging in the research of brain development and in child development needs to be, quote, curated and brought into everything from teacher training to the pedagogy of practice. And that's why I keep thinking that the one that's from 17 is only a hint at the challenges that she lays out in the next one. So anyway, I agree with you. Excuse me.
I think the other comment that was being made on a chat screen to me was that let's keep in mind where we're going with the meeting. And, my intention was that given the proposals that, policy proposals that Linda Darling-Hammond put forth in that policy framework, the question is whether or not that's a reasonable kind of follow-up to use with a meeting with Betty Rosa, the state ed commissioner, in terms of moving this forward, because I don't think there's any question that Betty Rosa will say, yeah, I think standardized testing is harmful to kids, but if not, if we don't have a high-stakes standardized test-driven curriculum and accountability process, what are we having? And I think what Linda is proposing, or what Peter described, is an alternative as to whether or not it's realistic and whether or not we have questions in terms of whether or not it's a good thing to advocate for, at this time, given the pandemic and the need for racial equity and justice, I think is the issue. So, Jamie, do you want to jump in with your question?
Sure. My question is just that in the framework provided, it really identifies that all of these elements are interrelated and dependent on one another. So I guess my question was just, is there a shift or a priority here as to what needs to happen first? Does it start in teacher preparedness? Does it start with educational policy, et cetera?
Well, yes, that's the right question, because at some point you got to take some steps, and even in her graphic in there, where she says it's kind of like the through line is we got to work on priorities in the short run. They try to protect the energy and accelerate the back end, and I don't disagree with that, but the first, like in your case in Rochester, it seems to me that you've got to get some positioning where between your school committee and your superintendent and what I would call the broader community, the community engagement conversation, has got to have a protocol to come to some common understandings of what's important to us. What are the outcomes we want for our children? And try to do that, having already approached the state, to support their patience in supporting that conversation. The last thing you need is for the state to show up with an answer. You need the state to respect this idea of to get to real community schooling is to believe that a community with support can have the kind of comprehensive conversation about what they want for their kids and what would have to do to get there, that people begin to own the problem solving as opposed to being resigned to the answer. And it's like, and Ralph, correct me if I'm wrong, it's trying to duplicate at a larger level what any decent principal has been able to do at one school community level. And the problem with the one school community level is, as he points out and others have, too often a school that is exceptional somehow gets isolated, they're different, and the leadership changes and it is sucked back to yesterday. So this has got to be something that has a larger community conversation, a more inclusive community conversation, particularly the people that have been least included, while you're trying to get the states and the mayors or whatever in a position to witness it for you and support you in doing it. And the other one I wanted to point out was that, Dan, in terms of even Linda's, in response to the assessment piece, this next document, which you really got to see, she's in here with example after example, example after example on places in this country that are putting on exhibition graduation demonstrations for credit. And I mean, there's a reference, and I've been to 2 of her seminars based on this new design. One was community schools, and there's some school community coordinators all over the country that you would blow, oh God, you just want to hug them. And then the other one is the people that are working on performance-based assessments that are embedded. It's, you know, it's what do you call it? It's a performance in the actual, it's assessment for learning. So the kid is putting on an exercise knowing that it's a kind of a self-audit. And there's all kinds of things going on already in that. And that's what I think the commissioner would be blown away by. But literally, these are national movements going on this minute that are all saying, if you're going to use the big test, if you have to use standardized testing as a program evaluation, we've all known forever that you can do it every couple of years with randomized samples, just like NAEP, and you'll get as much information of how effective you think you are as a big system as you're ever going to get with every kid. And with the every kid one, you're never going to get instructional improvement. That you cannot make those big systems be responsive enough to an individual student's in the learning cycle that it's useful. It is counterproductive. And she knows that.
Peter,
I wanted to call upon Jeanette Duderman, who's here from Long Island, to provide some perspective too. Jeanette, do you think, given your relationship with Betty Rosa and knowing where she's at philosophically, that she would be open to this kind of conversation?
Yeah, sorry, I don't have my video on because I'm in my car, like toting around. But yeah, Betty's open for all discussions on any of this. You know, again, like I said a few weeks ago, you know, the oxygen in the room is being completely sucked out by the COVID issues that are happening mostly in the city schools. You know, New York City in particular, Rochester, where you know, these gross inequities of what the funding to be able to pull off school right now is just a disaster. So right now the oxygen is being completely sucked out of the room with that. That's not to say that she wouldn't be open to listening to things that need to be done right now to move us forward and to start looking at some, you know, because right now there's space being created with the testing sort of being put on the back burner and hopefully being canceled, which is what we're pushing for. But that does create a space because you can't just, you know, remove such a big, large piece of our current education system and not have something else to be put in its place basically. And so what else is that then? You know, if the Regents exams are canceled, so high school courses, Regents courses can be completely transformed then. So what would that be? And I think they would, and I think she is open to looking at, you know, some direction to be given to districts on okay, so now what? So you don't have this Regents course that unfortunately these classes are completely centered around. So I think it's this whole thing is creating some challenges to getting the attention to other things, but it's also creating some room there that I think done correctly we can sort of take advantage of. And Lisa Rudley's on, I think also. Lisa, you can also chime in with, you know, Lisa has always been very, very close with Betty as well, and might have some more insight onto that.
I think Lisa may have left, and unless
okay.
she's hidden someplace. But here's my biggest concern with this in terms of advancing this concept with the commissioner, is that I don't see anybody, I mean, based on the last few webinars and Zoom conversations I've had with groups from Rock the Future and other conversations with community people, I don't see too many people who grasp the concept. Everything that's been done so far in terms of raising questions with the educational community is, okay, how can we advance higher standards and expectations of kids? And my question always with this is, for what? For what purpose? Is it to get high stakes test results? Is it to memorize and regurgitate again? Or is it to do something that's more meaningful in terms of a kid's education and their interest and their affect for learning? And I don't see much grasp of that by anybody. So what I'm thinking is that if this is going to be advanced, it's going to probably be from this group with the aid of people like Jeanette and Peter and maybe even hopefully Linda Darling-Hammond and other people who can back up this proposal. I don't think at this point, everybody's going to buy into it. But if there can be pilot schools across the state, Big Five schools, as well as other interested schools, whether they be from Long Island, Westchester County, wherever. Michael Haynes, his kind of thinking, I think, would fit right into it. But I guess that's my major concern is I would hope we could convince the superintendent and the school board to support something like this, but I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to approach that.
Dan?
And can I give you one more really interesting sort of perspective on all this that we've heard before, and this was sort of one of the reasons why UFT, I won't say UFT, I'll say specifically Michael Mulgrew, his excuse for why he he's actually one of the people behind pushing for the 3 through 8 assessments being such a huge part of teacher evaluation, or standardized tests in general being a huge part. And that was to ensure that because of the lack of local control in the city schools, that they wanted an objective measure rather than the subjective measures that would be left in the hands of principals, which they felt were not fair to teachers in many cases. And we just had a meeting. NICEAP just had a little meeting with AQE the other day, and the same issue came up. Is that, you know, if you push for more, you know, whole child and project based and all this, that, you know, somebody from AQE pointed out that, you know, one of the concerns of parents in some of these city schools would be that they are discriminated against in the classroom sometimes, and that an objective test like that, where, you know, the student can take this test and do well, and that would sort of balance out some discriminatory practices inside the classroom. So it was really interesting because, you know, you think of standardized tests as, you know, we all know that they're so discriminatory in nature, but there is that strange flip side to that, and there could be some like I told you guys a few weeks ago with Betty Rosa, where she did bring up that some of the Black and brown communities are the ones that would not be happy about the removal of our test-based system. And, you know, that could play a factor in that, what I just pointed out. So that's just something to be, considering, and also to add in with any kind of advocacy efforts that go on. Something like that would need to be acknowledged and sort of worked out on well, what could be done to solve that without these, tests that aren't measuring what everyone, claims that they measure. So then what is the solution to that issue?
Peter, I'd like you to respond to that, and then Ralph, and I don't know if Alicia has something to say too. Peter?
Well, I can only agree with the assessment. The issue is, how do you answer the question? And my experience is, again, I'm talking about national networks, where you can now go places and you can see kids from what I would call disadvantaged socioeconomic cultures, but also perfectly healthy ethnic cultures or racial cultures, and what they're doing for performance assessments it's like putting on black theater or something, or black literature at a critical analysis level that could compete with anything that a Regents exam talking about Shakespeare can do. So part of this is making sure that you don't dumb down the challenge of what you're dealing with in terms of the kid's pathway, but you make it absolutely authentic and relevant to them right this minute. And some of the best examples, particularly right now in COVID, at least at my med school, the big picture learning places, these kids went right into what's going on and the system is broken. And half of their projects now are dealing with getting access to and solving the problem of everything from the Wi-Fi to whatever, and getting resources to families, whether it's the food or the whatever. They're into the social justice part of this as their learning project. And they're constantly writing it and doing either not research as much as case studies, and it's that kind of when you see that done and you go out and you touch it, I find that, boy, you start showing that to people anywhere and they go, give me more of that. And these kids, when they stand up and all of a sudden you ask them a question, just the sheer passion that they come at you with, not angry, but just informed and analytical and problem solving. You go, oh, okay. So it's a both, yes and no, because I've been through the wars around the need for the diagnostics. Although they aren't diagnostics, they're summative, those tests. So again, there's subtleties in some of the stuff that Linda's writing about that I don't disagree with. Whenever you go away from the summative measures, there's plenty of decently still programmable diagnostic information, so that I'm not making it up when I say I think the kid is weak here or strong there or whatever. And Ralph, it's the same kind of stuff you were talking about earlier. Some of the diagnostic kind of placement mechanisms are perfectly legitimate. But then the issue is, what do you do with the information that you then have to create a learning challenge and a pathway that picks up on their strengths, that has the content in it, whether it's the critical thinking side, the research analysis side, the communicating, collaborating side. Those are all the stuff that you have to put together on an individualized basis. And you can still use the diagnostic information in terms of how much math does the kid need, what does he know, what does he need to do that problem, and how do you build that into the learning pathway. So that's why some of Linda's stuff, she's saying the biggest battle to get this done now, even if we all agreed, you've got to assume that the teacher training protocols we have in place do not position teachers to do this.
That's right.
So if somebody said, what's the first priority? I could say, well, teacher preparation. Well, that's a worse nightmare to change than the K-12 system. So in some ways, you got to know the pieces. You need to know the systemic pieces, and you pick off the ones you have images of strength in right now. Let's do that because we have capacity to do that. But let's understand there's no capacity in the big system to do this all well right now. So how do you keep finding partners and examples, and then get states with decent commissioners, like it sounds this one is, who would be smart enough to at least go, that's a good piece, run with that. We'll protect you in the sense of we're not going to get in your way while you do that. I mean, it's ground war, guerrilla warfare with good people. Or as John,
go ahead.
Yeah, so
trouble.
So folks, I know you, everyone here does this well. I have a list of heroes that I always look up to. One of them was Dr. Andy Doniger. He was a pediatrician and Monroe County Health Director. And he said this to me. He said, Ralph, I can't change the system from within. I need external pressure. Keep up with the Coalition to Prevent Lead Poisoning, and keep up that pressure. I remember those words, and I at the moment he said them, I said, this is a real man of character and courage. Now, what I want to ask the people in the Zoom meeting is, what do you think of Future Search and the ability for Future Search, if it's done correctly? It's been successful all over the world, to be a catalyst in moving what Peter is talking about for major rapid change. And that Future Search will, of course, bring in the universities for teacher preparation. We'll bring in all the partners. I mean, I'll leave it with this. Up until now, the education of our children, society's children, have been placed on the shoulders of the teachers. Well, that's wrong. It's everyone has to play a part. These are our children in our society, and it's our future, and it's not just a cliche. So Future Search may be able to get to the bottom of that, and let me hear from the opinions of other people here. Am I pie in the sky, or does this have value?
Ralph, other than Howie, Bart, and I, and you, I don't know if there's anybody else there. I don't know if everybody has a background with Future Search, and maybe that's something that we could do, because I think you're onto something in terms of having an organization and a process like Future Search to push this. But if folks are interested, we could do a session on Future Search too, using some of the resource people that we have to present it and then see if that's something that we could apply to this. I'm sure we could.
Well, Mike Moss, Dr. Mike Moss, and Dr. Hank Rubin,
Right.
they're running this forward. We should bring them into our meetings and see if we can coordinate what we're talking about with what they're actually moving forward.
Ralph, could you check with Hank Rubin to see whether or not that's a possibility, or at least Hank to present to us what he's...
Mike Moss is probably the guy. I just had lunch, 3 weeks ago I had lunch with Mike. I can connect with him.
Yeah, okay, let's talk about this offline, because I think that's a great idea. Alicia, you wanted to say something too.
Yes, hi, good afternoon to everyone. My thoughts are on the side of on the side of parents, and Jeanette made a very valid point when it comes to how parents perceive to be perceived. So how parents perceive it and how they feel it and they are received by teachers. Sometimes the parents are themselves intimidated by the teachers, and then in turn, sometimes the teachers are intimidated by the parents. And it's not as much as it used to be, where parents feel as though because the teacher has the degree in education that the teacher is always right, and the teacher is the be all and end all, and the student has no say, and whatever the teacher says goes. that's not how many of parents today operate. And for so many of the teachers, that's how they expect parents to operate. And there's a clash right there. When you have one of the benefits of, say, Regents exams is that they are objective. You know, if you learn the material, or even if it's rote, and you get the right answers and you pass the test, you pass. If you go to another model that's more subjective, then you have and you don't deal with the systemic racism and the systemic ideologies that are within the communities and culture, and you go to a more subjective model, then it might be perceived by people of color that, oh, well, I didn't pass because he didn't like me, or he or she is racist, and I didn't take a test. It's just on that person's opinion if they like my project. And he didn't like my project because he just didn't understand, because it's a Black thing and they just don't get it. And the teacher may have minored in African American studies. Who know? You don't know. They may have the information, and the project may not have been worthy, but that perception is one that would be hard to get around. So I think there should be, in the presentation, there should be somehow options or a balance between the testing and the student led, because there's pros and cons on both sides and both ways. Peter and Dan know, having been my teachers, and I've shared with them that I as having been with them at interim junior high in the 80s. I mean, I loved them, 70s rather, late 70s. I loved it. I loved that way of learning. And when I got to a traditional high school, I loathed it, because that expressive model, that learning and delving into the things that you have an interest in, and I just flourished. I felt. My parents had another idea. They didn't like it. They did not like it at all. They wanted that traditional road and method, because they felt that I was spending too much time in one area or in one subject, flourishing more in one subject and not spending time in another. And in some ways they were right, because I love social studies. And math, I wasn't getting it. So I just wanted to add that, as well as I wanted to look at the implementation of it, and the guerrilla warfare. I think a stealth method would be in the teacher training. And Empire State College, I don't know if you guys noticed, but they have now an EDD now. So they're looking at innovation in learning and teaching as a part of this new doctoral program. So I think the educators from this group are innovative and are persons who I believe who can and would be impactful in the Empire State model. That it's just coming about, it's new, it's fresh. They're looking for students, and they most likely would be looking for instructors, or can't remember what they called at Empire, because when the professors, and for people to teach this model, and therefore I think you guys can get that in, because if you're teaching and you have people who are looking at ways to innovate, there you go. That's your next generation.
Thank you so much for that, Alicia. A couple comments about what you said. One is that, I mean, it's really important, I think, to focus on those parental concerns that you have. I could address that from a School Without Walls perspective, because we had so many individual projects and required projects that kids had to do. But I think from the big picture perspective, Peter might be able to provide us with the perspective of how the mentors of big picture students work with parents and students to help them identify their passion in terms of the direction that they want to go. Peter, did you want to talk about that, or?
Yeah, only in the sense that I think she framed the problem right. Because the conventional system doesn't even have a system to assume that you're going to form a partnership with the parent on behalf of a shared responsibility for the student. So when somebody does it, either they can do it well by accident or by knowledge, or they can do it badly unintentionally. I mean, so part of all of this, to me, has to acknowledge going into it that you can't when you say a subjective judgment, you have to know going into that that's going to be a problem unless you have already made your partnership with either, like we just said. Imagine making partnerships with the university players so that when you're putting together the rubrics for these decisions on whatever you're going to do, it's transparent. You can test it. You can watch it over time. The parents are already involved with it. The mentor's already involved with it. The ones at the Met School in Providence, the advisor, their responsibility is to make sure that they've got the ones that are the pros or the professionals or the whatever that are guiding, first of all, the planning of the project, and then they're the one doing the first round of feedback with the students. And at the end game, they're part of the panel that says, no, professionally, do you realize, and they can show examples of that work done by a professional and what the professional would be qualified as. And that takes years to put together well, but the point is, it's not that you shouldn't do it. You can't, it's like anything else. You can't do it in a small group and make it up over here and then administer it without third-party witnesses and research-based evidence and all that kind of stuff. But that's what I'm saying is going on now nationally, that the doors are opening, the opportunity's coming, and there are partnerships ready to do it and film it and use anchors. And you can get anchor images now of all kinds of projects that say this is something that for a 12th grade summative one or a middle school, whatever, that database is now available.
Go ahead, John.
I can just see Alicia really express something to me here. Made that crystal clear. There's such, as you can see, for parents of color, then they have to know that what's going into this is not the white privilege that's always gone into it. Mm-hmm. When you think of the educational system, it's run by white people, and so their experience is going to be what really governs most of what happens. And I think that I love what you're talking about here. As soon as you started talking about it at the beginning, my juices were going already. But I think we have to find a way to make sure that it's safe for all students. Yeah. And that particularly students of color are looked out for here. Yeah. Because we do things, we as white people, I'll say it again, we entered this meeting with white privilege, and we're going to leave this meeting with white privilege. Mm-hmm. That's right. And that is a tough nut to crack. And I think we've always got to be aware of that when we're setting up situations like this for kids. That's right. But it'd be a shame to lose this opportunity of doing things in this way because of that. I think we got to find a way around this.
Alicia?
So I'm wondering, are there learning style assessments where by, say, the 6th grade, it could be identified what is the best, which learning styles work best for this child? And then instead of the model where, okay, this you are putting you on a Regents track or a non-Regents track, putting someone on a traditional model of learning or a self-paced style learning. So do what's best for the child. This new model might not be good for everybody.
Right.
The traditional model might work.
Mm-hmm.
So identify learning styles and then put the child on the track to learn in the method and way that he or she learns best.
I don't think there's anything wrong with the possibility in the city school district of there being schools that perhaps do use the Regents-driven curriculum. And then there's others that are on perhaps for a high school, a vocational, high standards vocational track to prepare kids who want to go right into work. And a third, which would be more the liberal arts, school without walls type of thing that Peter has been describing, that students could opt into as well. But the big thing, I mean, from a Rich Ryan and Ed Deasy perspective of intrinsic motivation would be to give, if you want to achieve significant learning and success, you've got to provide some choice, some relevance in terms of education for them to have a choice in terms of the direction they want to go. And then not only within that pathway of vocational liberal arts or Regents driven, but also within those courses themselves, more choice and personal direction in terms of project-based learning and individual research, and maybe focus on the kind of skills, whether they be critical thinking, creative problem solving, connections with the community, collaboration with other students, those types of things that would be evaluated. So obviously that could be done more with a curriculum if you have more flexibility. But Bart, I know you've been dying to say something. You want to go ahead?
You gotta take it off mute.
I know. I'm gonna pass.
Okay.
I'm gonna pass.
I have a comment.
Okay, go ahead, Ralph.
Yeah, a fast comment. John and Alicia, there may be a possible anecdote, possible neutralizer for what you're saying is one of the mantras I have always said, and I infuse this in the culture with my staff, is that I don't care how many college degrees you have. I don't care. You will never know that child as well as the parent. And if you think that you can carry this burden alone for education for that child, then you're kidding yourself. You're fooling yourself. You're lying to yourself. You must make a partnership with the parent. You must create that bridge. That is not the responsibility of the parent to make that bridge. It is the responsibility of the professional teacher to make that bridge. And in making that bridge, I mean, you care for the child. The parent loves that child. And so, in doing so, when you truly make that bridge with the parent as an authentic partner in that child's education, you neutralize many of the things we're talking about here. And that has to be infused in the culture of our teaching. That is non-existent now, as far as I can tell. It may pop up once in a while, but I don't hear that in college education. I don't hear that being talked about with educational leaders. And that, if we don't do that, all the things we're talking about here is for naught.
Different mindset. Go ahead, Dan.
I'm wondering if this is an opportunity, given what we know about the huge demonstrated impact of integrated schools, to test the concept, test the number of these concepts that we've been talking about in the development of socioeconomically diverse magnet schools that would draw from both city and suburbs, and use those partly, Dan, you mentioned earlier, pilot projects, pilot schools. Perhaps we could use some of those kinds of magnet schools as pilots to test some of these different concepts in a setting that we really haven't examined so far. So seems to me this is an opportunity. Maybe that could be one of the things that comes out of a future search thing, to tie back to Ralph's comment. But it seems to me this is an opportunity to test some of these concepts in an integrated, socioeconomically diverse setting that the research indicates will have huge impact if you do it right. And if we could merge that concept with some of the concepts that we're talking about here in terms of learning styles, seems to me this could be a very rich opportunity for testing some of these things in a context that is likely to be very successful in improving outcomes for a wide range of students.
I think it's a great comment, Don, in terms of applying what Peter has been talking about and what Linda Darling-Hammond has been advocating to the magnet school interdistrict concept for desegregation. I think that's another piece I think that we often forget is the evidence from the research in terms of the benefits for both kids of color and white students who are in desegregated schools. Peter, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I completely concur in the opportunity there, but given what we now know about all these other conversations about subjective and whatever and regions and whatever, the test that's coming for too many of the intentionally desegregated, voluntarily desegregated programs, because of all the other inertia and all the biases that exist in the system, over the very, very short period of time, you still end up with 2-track systems in a desegregated school. There's the fast track or the regions track, and there's other tracks, and you end up with the same. They're segregated in the same place, but that's still the right place to have this conversation.
But it doesn't have to be that way, Peter.
That's my point. If we go down that road with the full knowledge of what it takes to bring together a full community,
right?
In a really democratic, I hear you, I value you, yes, you have equal authority and equal access to decisions and into priorities. That would be the magic for me right there, because I've been part of all the desegregation attempts, but the energy that would have to go in to do that right is worth the battle if we did it that way.
Yeah. Jeanette, are you still with us? Jeanette Duderman? Well,
sorry, yes, I am.
Okay. Any comments on what we've been sharing so far in terms of desegregation efforts for magnet schools?
Yeah, I mean, as I'm listening, to all of these discussions, it's like the one thing that I'm always thinking about when we, because it's all about advocacy, right? Like, it's not just about, well, tell people what should be, and we're talking about like the choice of everything, and really what it comes down to is we have to do major marketing, and that's always, the opt-out movement has been all about marketing, and it sounds, I don't know, it has a dirty connotation to it, but that's what it is. So when you have the information that we know the standardized tests are discriminatory, we know that this whole child type of learning would work best, but people are scared of something new, and they don't know what it would be, and they don't even know the possibilities. And when Peter, you're talking about you saw some of these programs, how amazing. That's the idea, just that sentence, if they saw. So that's where the marketing comes in, where, you know, you do have to sell some of this stuff a little bit in the sense of getting people to just see what the possibilities are. And that's sort of what we did with the opt-out is we got very creative about how to get parents to even see or know what the alternatives were, because we are so deeply rooted into the traditional way of learning. And like I said, with COVID now, even those that really love the traditional way of schooling and would like things to stay the same, now again is that unique opportunity that they can't do. So even those diehards for it know that that's just not working right now, and it's not going to work probably for the foreseeable future. So again, we now have this opening where now's the time to start introducing some of these, alternate ways of teaching and learning. And so just as we sort of start crafting some of this stuff and pulling in other communities, we reached out to AQE. We've worked with them in the past, but it's really important. They have a wide base. They have people in Rochester too. I should connect you guys with them and the organizations that they work with through Rochester, because it really does take on some of those other perspectives that we wouldn't think about. Like, I wouldn't have thought that, there is a component to the idea of discriminatory practices in the classroom where the kids sometimes look at the tests as their saving grace. Like, no matter how much the teacher doesn't like me, I can get the grade that I, work to get on this test without anybody being able to stop me from that. So, that has to still be acknowledged while we start to figure out, and it is onion layers. It's just so many layers intertwined, between, the local issues and the federal issues and all this sort of old, deep-rooted stuff from hundreds, 100 years ago is what we're battling against. And, so I know I'm kind of just rambling on, but these are all things like flashing through my brain as we're talking.
Well, one beauty of this whole thing is that if we were to go with the concept of a magnet school or other voluntary schools within Rochester that would like to implement this type of philosophy and methodology, that it would be a great research project in terms of the outcomes of students who move through this pathway versus those that are in traditional pathways. And let me remind you that I think the research that was done way back in the early 40s on the 8-year study of the Dewey schools and the positive results of that pretty much matches that of the consortium schools in New York State in terms of college performance and actually citizenship participation as well. So there's a lot of good stuff.
Can I jump in for one second? The consortium schools now, that was something that we pushed the regions back a few years ago. We didn't really get anywhere, but that might be something to revisit, is to open back up. They had clamped down on how many consortium schools could be in existence, right? And they cut it off and they said, New York City, that's it. We're not allowing this to spread anywhere else. Out on Long Island, we had a superintendent who transformed his whole school, Dr. Joe Rella, who passed away recently, but he was amazing, and he turned his whole school into a project-based learning school. And he started with a small group, and it grew and grew, and the parents all demanded to have their kids it was like a school within a school, until now. I believe that the majority of the school is performance-based, all the high school. And he applied to be a consortium school and to get the waivers from the regions, and he was denied. Now, that was still under the old sort of regime of things, so that might be an avenue worth looking back into, is having them open those applications back up and allowing schools to apply to be consortium schools. Because that really does allow for this choice of, if the community wants this kind of school, then that's the school they should have.
Mm-hmm. Alicia, did you have a comment on that?
So I think that the marketing that as it was mentioned earlier, is key. And I think marketing this as an alternative to the alternative, and the alternative is charter school, and this can be an alternative to the alternative. And since parents look at charter schools as not being the city school, even though they don't always realize that they're tax dollars and it's still a public school and their tax dollars are paying for it. It could be a way, if with some very good marketing, I think it can be an attractive alternative to the alternative.
That's a great comment, Alicia. Ralph, quick comment, and then I've got to sum up, but go ahead.
Real fast. So I don't know if we need to create magnet schools. In my mind, I could be wrong, but the charter schools were originated to have an alternative in the business environment. Whether that was in good faith or not can certainly be debated. But certainly, it goes back to my point I said before, that throughout this whole big nation, and actually throughout this world, there has to be examples that we're talking about. There are successful schools that are implementing the 5 or 6 things that Peter has told us about. And we need to be serious about doing our research, taking these models and seeing how they can be replicated in Rochester. I mean, we're not doing that. And why in the hell do we need to reinvent the wheel every time that we're talking about these issues? We only need to open our eyes, do the research, find exemplars, and say, okay, that's working. We're not doing that.
Another comment, John?
Yeah, the thing that we have to really focus on is getting things going right now. I mean, this fall is a very important period because we're going to have a lot of social upheaval. There's going to be a lot of posturing in Washington. Who knows where things are going to go and how smoothly. But we're going to be working primarily online or a hybrid method that is going to keep the principals and the teachers and the parents interested in finding where do we want to go and how can we make things better. I sit on 5 community engagement teams in the Southwest, and there's a whole spectrum of how well are they pulling things together right now, and there are some that are very much in need of getting parents on their CET teams. I'm sure they'd love to have some people from this group get involved, but they were all struggling with how do we improve interaction between the schools and the parents and the students, and it would be good to really do some marketing to these schools. One of the things I'm hoping, I sent out some of Peter's 2 documents here to a lot of the folks who join our Southwest Common Council Education Committee each month, and I'm hoping to share the video of this meeting with them, because I think a lot of the things that have been getting discussed in this meeting are going to be things that they're interested in, and we need to try to reach out to all of these areas and see how much energy we can build up.
Thanks, John. It's a good comment in terms of reaching out to other groups and sharing these transformative possibilities. Just in terms of summing up, and then I want Peter to have a few final words if he wants, is that a lot of this, I think, is, for example, Jeanette's comments on the New York State Board of Regents rejecting applications for schools to become members of the consortium schools was based upon the regent's perception, particularly Betty Rosa's, that if there were new members coming into the consortium and not following ESA's standardized testing rules, that they may jump into that and not only prevent any new applicants to the schools, to the consortium, but also maybe destroy the consortium. So they did that more as a protective measure. But the answer, I think, lies in a new administration. I think if we do have a new administration, the question is going to be, what kind of person is Joe Biden going to appoint? Is it going to be a Linda Darling-Hammond type person or not? Or is it going to be an Arnie Duncan again? I think Diane Ravitch, her comment to me when I asked her who they think will be the appointee, was that whoever it's going to be better than Betsy DeVos. So, I mean, we can count on that. But, so I think that's a key in terms of what happens with a new Secretary of Education. The other thing is in terms of a marketing strategy of how to move this whole concept that we're talking about. I'd like to pull a couple people from the consortium, plus Peter and perhaps Jeanette Duderman, in terms of coming up with a marketing strategy locally and then with Betty Rosa. How do we move that in terms of both through the commissioner and what can we do locally with it as well? So I think that's, a couple of our key moves. And then just a reminder for everybody, next Friday, Idonia is scheduled to lead us in a discussion of the book Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. So if you haven't got the book yet, I encourage you to get it and read it. If you don't have time for that, perhaps go onto YouTube. And I know Joy DeGruy has several speeches. They're short, 25 minutes or whatever. Watch a couple of those if you don't have time to read the book. But we're scheduled to meet again next Friday at 4 to discuss that book with her. In the meantime, as I said, I'm going to try and work with a few people in terms of developing a marketing strategy for this concept. Peter, any final words?
Only that given, and it's funny, given that's a conversation next week, my sensibility right now is along the lines of there's opportunities in front of us, and I think we've got to get into a larger network. This conversation is going on in bigger, more supported networks than this one. We got to pick one. I don't know. I can talk with you later about that, because an awful lot of what we're looking for either examples or leverage is already out there. And that's Ralph's point. We don't, because I think we're much too isolated, and the other one has to do with next week's conversation, and that we're much too white. So the issue of however we're going forward, we've got to leverage our research communications as into something larger than Rochester, and we have to hold on to the fact that as we go out to secure, examine, whatever, are we representative among ourselves, and are we hearing what we need to hear, so that whatever we end up thinking we're advocating for doesn't. We haven't. None of us have solved that problem yet. So we're not representative enough. And the images of, even if you took literally everything that was presented today, the way we would administer it tomorrow would not be as inclusive as the intent in the literature. We've got to get the players that we think we're serving to be leading in the administration of the execution.
Right. That's part of my question in terms of local marketing. You know, how are we going to move this locally as well? So, okay, folks. Anybody else have anything to say for the good of the order? Thanks, Peter, for leading this discussion and providing us with some perspective on something we really haven't got into deep enough. But I think I still learn every time I get with you, so this is good. Yeah. Good. Good. Me too. Connie, go ahead. You're muted.
See?
You're muted, Connie. Mute. She's just waving goodbye.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
See ya.
Take
Be
care.
kind.
Be kind.
Take care of yourselves.
Goodbye.
Bye, Alicia.
Bye.